ultimately from the study will depend on complementary and aligned local land use, urban design guidelines, and zoning ordinances to create the environment that allows that market demand to take advantage of any investment that's made. So that's just to recap. This is not new, but just it's been a while since we've talked about it. Just wanted to put that back out there. In terms of specific project updates, there are a couple of changes that we've made since the last time we've met. In terms of project management, since Mary Connolly moved on to the private sector, specifically to WSP, I've taken on the role as project manager. This is a really important study, and I know we've had some issues along the way in terms of its schedule. And we want to make our mayors and our community leaders very proud of the outcome. So we're going to make sure that gets done. On the WSP side, I just couldn't be more happy with Glenn Coyne, who is the new project manager there. Glenn and I worked back in 2007 and 2008 on the Northeast Corridor study that ultimately recommended what got into the Improve Act to connect Nashville with the Northeast Corridor through Hendersonville and Gallatin, and what's happening on State Route 386 now. I like that project a lot because it reflects that these studies actually do produce recommendations that move towards implementation, and that's a study that Glenn and I and Felix Castrodad and Max Baker and a few others, Mary Beth Eichert and a few others on this call were part of. So there is new project management that's different than the last time you met us. There's also additional experts from the WSP team that have been added as we begin to think about all the details associated with design and implementation. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Glenn or Brad Winkler to talk about some of the new faces there at WSP.
Hey, thanks, Michael. This is Brad Winkler. I'm the Tennessee area manager for WSP here in Nashville. As Michael has already mentioned, over the winter and as we moved into the current phase of work, we've made some transitional changes on our management team. We brought in Glenn Coyne to help steer us to the completion of this project, and he has, as Michael mentioned again, a work history with Michael on the Northeast Corridor. We also added Michael Flatt to our team as a senior advisor to kind of help make sure that we have the appropriate level of resourcing available to work on this project moving forward. Some of you know Michael came over from another engineering firm, Gresham Smith, after about 25 years of experience and brings about 40 total years of experience to our team. Another team member that some of you have been engaging with on station area planning and TOD work is Holly Stork. She's one of our nationally recognized experts in land use planning. And then you are going to hear later a lot from Luke Sullivan on the alternatives. And Luke is an engineer in our Nashville, Tennessee office, and he's been charged with kind of corralling our national and regional rail and bus experts as we looked at the engineering aspects for these different alternatives.
Thank you, Brad. And then another update quickly is we had a really good internal team meeting, GNRC, WeGo, and the consultants back in September of last year to kind of shake loose that scope of work and figure out how best to sort of come down the home stretch with a good solid recommendation. And out of that came some brainstorming about how best to utilize the partnering firms, so the subcontractors to WSP. And Brad, Glenn, y'all want to talk about some of the new collaboration you're doing with Wilmot, some of the other partners?
Sure. Thank you, Michael. This is Glenn Coyne. It's great to be with you all. One of the things that's struck me coming into this project is how well everybody's been talking to each other and the amount of coordination that's been happening. And one of the real pleasures that I've had so far is working with Tiffany Wilmot and her crew, and they've been just great to work with. And I'll talk a little bit about that later when we get into the evaluation of the alternatives as to how we're working together. And you'll see that partnership is something that's really working well. And I believe Tiffany is going to join us on the call. And so if there's specific questions, we can talk about those later. Thanks, Michael.
Thank you, Glenn. A couple more updates for you. One is we understand the importance of coordinating with TDOT. And TDOT's a big organization, so that can mean a lot of things. So we mean specifically TDOT leadership and their engineering professionals. We have a good relationship with the planning staff, and have been coordinating with them all along. But for this to be successful, we've got to make sure we're talking directly to the commissioner level at TDOT, as well as the engineers that are going to be in the weeds on implementation. And also we need to do, I think, a better job of collaborating with the local planners and engineers to get their buy-in and their ideas, because ultimately it's their communities that we're trying to facilitate a project for. And so we've began a lot of that coordination with the local planners as we've engaged in thinking about land uses around transit stations, but we're committed to doing more of that down the home stretch. As it relates to TDOT and just other state leadership in general, one other update I want to make mention is that we've brought on Stones River Group, who we have a relationship with already in terms of government affairs and community engagement, but they've got a specific role on the study now to help make sure that we're talking to the right folks at the state, both in the governor's office and TDOT, but also state legislature. I mean, ultimately, we can already anticipate policy and legislative hurdles that we'll need to overcome. So we need to be building project champions at all levels of government to be able to tackle those at the appropriate time as we go through the progression of implementing rapid transit in this corridor. And then finally, since we last met, there is a new online data share for distributing project materials and deliverables. That link is in your email, but if you have any issues with that, let me know. We've already posted all the reports that we're going to be talking about today through the presentation, but the presentation itself is also posted to that data share. So those are some updates on the project. I do appreciate everybody's patience and candor to which you have spoken to your level of satisfaction with our progress. And I hear you. And we are seriously committed to making sure that we come out of this with a meaningful project, a community-driven recommendations for implementing rapid transit that is not naive to the context around it. And I'm really excited about the new faces on the consultant side and really excited about the new energy that is permeating the project team on the government side. So with that, let me get into the quick update on the progress of deliverables. I don't want to dwell on this. I'm going to go through it pretty quickly. Again, if you have questions, just put them in the chat or email us and we'll get back to you. But just as I talk about the deliverables, more specifically WSP to talk about some of these deliverables, just want to remind everybody that the study really is built around three big phases. One is really that is completed about a year ago, is the community visioning and listening sessions to understand how the folks on the ground, the people that live within the corridor and work within the corridor and invest within the corridor, to truly understand what their expectations are for solving problems that they're experiencing daily, and to get their initial ideas about how those perspectives may shift with a growth trend that we know is headed our way. So that was phase one, just to understand where people are in their thinking about mobility challenges and quality of life. Phase two was built on phase one. So from the phase one conversations, we constructed a universe of alternatives, and I mean specifically transportation options, that we thought were most suitable for addressing folks' mobility challenges. And we conducted another series of workshops and stakeholder meetings to present that universe to them, sort of a wide view of all the options that we might consider to improve mobility. We got some feedback from that. We've narrowed that down to a very specific set of alternatives that we are now designing so that we can test them and share results back to the public for their final feedback, which is what phase three is that we take that narrowing down of the transportation options that we heard were more preferable from the community. We test them through a few different screens, which we're going to talk about today, to ultimately give them some analysis so that they can look at those options from an informed position, tell us what they like or don't like about each of them, so that ultimately we can get at that community-driven option to move forward through the planning and programming process on the transportation side. So that's the sort of the arc of the study. The ultimate deliverable is more than one thing. The big thing is that community-driven recommendation for how to implement or for implementing regional transit in the corridor. The ultimate deliverable will come with a recommendation or a set of recommendations for how to phase that in, how to fund it, and ultimately how to overcome some of the challenges we know will exist along the way towards implementation. And there'll also be recommendations for short-term actions that we can do now to ready the environment for that major investment down the road. And I'm talking about things like optimizing and augmenting the existing transit service, guidance for local planning pertaining to land development and right-of-way, and it's guidance only. There's no sort of top-down policy that we're going to be applying, but it's a conversation with locals about what day-to-day decisions they're making that ready the environment or are a barrier ultimately. Suggested considerations for pursuing changes to local or state policies as part of the set of recommendations, and usable information for continued education and outreach, because the study is really just the beginning when it comes to engaging the public in ultimately why this is necessary and what needs to happen in order to make it a reality. That's the big deliverable, but there are a series of deliverables along the way. And I'm going to ask Glenn Coyne to walk us through 4 key deliverables that are in production and the status of them. Glenn?
Thanks, Michael. Yes, to get us to that ultimate deliverable, we do have a series of benchmarks and milestones that we're getting to. And first and foremost is where are we now, and what does the corridor look like, and what is the nature of the corridor? And so that's what we call our current conditions and trends report. And there was a draft that was completed at the very beginning of the year, but we decided that we want to dive into that and look at how it was designed, what the vision of that document looked like, what language it used, and be very set the stage for the rest of the deliverables. And so we've spent some time going through there, and as you can see on the screen, there's over 35 maps that we've tried to standardize and make be able to tell that story graphically as much as we can. So that's what we're spending time on wrapping up, so that tells the story that we'd like it to tell for what the current conditions and some of the trends in the corridor are. You're going to hear from Luke in just a minute to describe the different alternatives that we have. Along with those graphics and the maps that were prepared, there is a report that goes along with each of those alternatives, and we hope that you take an opportunity to read those. There's a lot of engineering and other research that went into those reports that that describe those alternatives that we're going to go through today. So those reports are there. Also, as we look to implementation and what a system might look like and rapid transit in the corridor might look like, we have to take a look at how they're going to operate and what the maintenance costs would be and what the service plans are. And so we've taken some preliminary estimates of those. There's a summary report that we've put together that describes that, so that even at this early stage of planning, we can have an idea of what that what we call O&M, operations and maintenance, is going to look like. And then, and really one of the most important things, and I'll emphasize Michael's point as well, is that reaching out to the community, reaching out to stakeholders and the public, and hearing what they think. And there's a very long report which summarizes and it provides detail as to what we heard from those first 2 rounds of public engagement and outreach. We captured all of the questions, the comments, the sticker dot exercises, the online interactions. There's a lot of data that we received from the community and from the stakeholders, and that's been put into a report as well. So again, these are all just interim parts of getting us to that ultimate deliverable, the report that we'll have at the end, but each of these are steps along the way that get us there.
Thank you, Glenn, for that. Any questions? We've really, we've set the table now for the core feature of today's presentation, which is a look at the definition of these alternatives. So let me just pause here to see if there's any questions about anything that we've presented so far in terms of updates to the study and the progression through the deliverables. Anybody want to chime in at this point? I'll give it a second, give you all a second to raise your hand or to offer any comments. Okay, well, if you have any comments, feel free to share those in the chat. I understand sometimes the challenge of the online platform in terms of facilitating a good conversation. So we'll move forward. As I introduce Luke more formally to talk about the build options that we're about to test, I just wanted to remind everybody of what the baseline improvements and expectations are that we're assuming are givens. And so obviously, we're not going to go from where we are today to fixed guideway transit overnight. There's a series of investments and improvements and modifications that will ultimately happen along the way. And I think these are things that are going to happen along the way, regardless of whether or not we ever invest in fixed guideway transit in the corridor. And so I just wanted to put these out there as things that we're already assuming to be the case into the future. Number one is that we assume we're going to continue to implement the programmed roadway and intersection improvements that are identified in a TDOT 3-year work program, or the transportation improvement program of the Transportation Policy Board, or the capital budgets of local government and transit agencies. So we're assuming that to be the case, that we're going to continue to improve transportation through a series of other investments that I think hopefully will be complementary to the rapid transit recommendation we come up with, but are going to be improving mobility regardless of what comes out of this study. Another thing we assume is that we're going to end up providing more frequent commuter bus service as money becomes available over the years. So funding is obviously a challenge to doing that right now, but as demand continues to build for those services, we're going to have to figure out how to pay for them to provide that to the market that is out there. So we assume that that's going to happen. We also assume that bus on shoulder, as it becomes an opportunity, that we're going to take advantage of that opportunity. So this study isn't to design a bus on shoulder service. We assume that as opportunities arise for bus on shoulder service, that we take advantage of that. And I know that TDOT has already looked at some preliminary done some preliminary analysis on where those opportunities exist on the existing network. But the issue of bus on shoulder is a complex one that we'll need to wade through, but it's not specific outcome of the study. Another baseline assumption is that we're going to increase the frequency and availability of local transit service, the Muletown Trolley, Franklin Transit Authority, Nashville MTA, WeGo Public Transit, that those services will continue to expand frequencies, geographic coverage, and time of day service hours. We assume that we will upgrade technologies along the I-65 corridor to bring it on par with the I-24 Smart Corridor. We don't assume that it will be the same application of technologies, but we assume that it will receive equal treatment and attention from the transportation partners into the future. We also assume increase in the amount of mixed use and higher density development along the corridor, just according to the existing local plans, which provide policy for that. And we assume the market will take advantage of that opportunity for mixed use and higher density development along the way. So those are the baseline improvements that we're assuming that aren't specifically an outcome of our study. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Luke now, who is the lead WSP staff expert around the definition of the alternatives. We've got a couple of alternatives related to commuter rail, light rail, and bus rapid transit. And so with that, Luke, I'm turning it over to you.
Hey, Michael, this is KB. Can I ask you a quick question?
Sure thing, KB.
You said test. What does that really mean when you say test?
Yeah, I mean, we can get into some of this a little bit later, but in short, what we mean is that we've designed some transportation options that Luke is going to talk about. And then we're going to ultimately test each one of them in terms of how well they will perform in addressing mobility needs. But we're also testing them to understand better the cost benefit of each option to just overall quality of life and economic opportunity. And we referenced Tiffany Wilmot earlier in the call, and her team is really looking at a triple bottom line analysis of each of these options to see how they will either impact in a positive or negative way, our residents, our businesses, the economic opportunity into the future. And then we're also testing each of these options from a political feasibility standpoint as well. So it's really a 3-part test that we're applying to each one of these alternatives that Luke is about to talk about. Does that answer your question, KB?
So it's mostly you're talking modeling and simulation test, not actual like live testing of it.
Well, part of what I said would depend on models, but not everything. But what was the second part of your question? You said not what?
I'm trying to understand if you say test, for example, for some of the light rail, are we looking at having some runs on those locations to see how we go, like a pilot, or we just
Oh, I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
I'd love to do that. In fact, this is a side conversation, but yeah, I mean, I'd love to do that. There was a point, before sort of all this changed, and even before Faye's arrival in Mayor Cooper's office, and they started on their planning effort there. But we were looking into a big transportation expo as part of our planning process that would have demonstrated some of the things that we're talking about. I think that's still out there as a possibility, but not something we're specifically working on now. But the idea of bringing into town a DMU or a light rail vehicle that doesn't require the overhead electrification, that we could run on the tracks as a community demonstration. So I think it's a good idea. We'd love to do it. It's not something we're specifically working on right now, though.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. All right, Luke, you have the floor.
Thanks, Michael. As Michael said and Brad said, my name is Luke Sullivan. I'm an engineer in WSP's Nashville office, and I'm helping out right now with developing the alternatives evaluation report, the one that's been sent out to, I think, all of you for review. What we're doing basically is we're pulling together some of WSP's experts from around the country to take a look at some of the build alternatives that are available for the study area and what we can do. What works, what doesn't work, the benefits, the disadvantages of each, any kind of engineering challenges that may pop up. But as Michael alluded to, we do have 3 build alternatives of commuter rail, light rail transit, and bus rapid transit. Jumping right into commuter rail, I think everybody is aware of the WeGo Star. That's probably the best example that we have around here of what a commuter rail would look like. And typically, it's something where you see a longer distance regional travel between the suburbs and downtown, basically carrying commuters. Usually, you can do that with existing freight rail infrastructure, locomotives. You can use freight rails. You can use larger cars that are comparable in size and weight to freight cars. We also have diesel multiple units, DMU, as noted in the presentation. These are ones that would be closer to what you would have for street light rail transit. They can run in the street. They can navigate with a little bit better in terms of grades and curves, in more urban conditions than what you would have for commuter rail. But commuter rail generally is limited in frequency of service hours to peak commutes. Again, it's intended to carry commuters through downtown, between downtown and the suburbs. We have one alignment for the commuter rail. Basically, it runs from downtown Nashville to downtown Columbia. This typically runs along the CSX lines, adjacent to the CSX lines on the west side. So if you can imagine for your respective communities where the CSX tracks are in your community, the alignment basically would run just west of it within the right of way. We did go through and for each one of these alternatives, look at it from a design standpoint. We obviously didn't go to the same detail that you would go to in an actual design, but we tried to look at it from a design point of view and see where we had bridges that need to be widened, new bridges, stream crossings, environmental issues, any sort of engineering challenges like that. But this alignment ends up being about 48 miles in length. As you can see the numbers, we have about 10 modified bridges. These are mostly overpasses or underpasses of the rail line. We'll have 25 grade crossings and about 29 stream crossings or otherwise new rail bridges. We did talk to CSX. We did ask CSX about their requirements for using their infrastructure. I know a lot of people in the public, you guys have probably been to public meetings where somebody says, well, why don't y'all just kick CSX off and use the rail for transit? But it is their rails, it is their private property. So we did reach out to them to see what their requirements are for transit operation on their infrastructure. You can see those requirements here. Basically, the answer right now is no track sharing with various separations regarding how close you are to their existing infrastructure. and grade separate with no tunneling and then no electrification. This is something that's obviously it's guidelines that they have right now. It's something that could be open to negotiation with them in specific areas, in specific case-by-case type situations where you have a, you have something that needs to be overcome. We can always go back to them. We do have a typical station shown here in the next slide for a commuter rail station. This is in the 100 Oaks area in South Nashville. As you can see, typically you would just have a station like you would think for a rail station. We do have shown here some multi-level parking structure, again, to serve commuter traffic. So this operates as sort of like a park and ride type situation. And this is, again, just typical for what you would see for a station and layout in this area. Moving on to the challenges. I'll try not to go too much in depth to every single challenge. It is available in the reports. But the main challenge for commuter rail is, trying to negotiate with this, having new right of way in these urban areas. We do have here shown a way to connect the WeGo Central Terminal to the CSX, existing CSX infrastructure in downtown Nashville. This is more where you would see a DMU operation. It's not necessarily in mixed traffic, but it is on the street in a dedicated lane or in a guideway that's adjacent to the streets. This is where you would see slower speeds, tighter radii, trying to navigate the intersections and the curves. And this is kind of getting into the main issue that we're having, or the main challenge with commuter rail, is that when we have to buy a new right of way, if we have to buy a new right of way adjacent to CSX, that we're having to go through these developed areas. Obviously, the Gulch is one of the fastest growing neighborhoods in Nashville. There's a lot of high rise development that's being either already constructed or being proposed here. Assyrian's new headquarters, Gulch Crossings, Pine Street Flats, Velocity are all immediately adjacent to the existing CSX rail yard that's here. So we would have to figure out a way to get around that. And you can see in the leftmost picture, the area that we were talking about in the Gulch. There's challenges throughout the entire route in terms of things that may have to be relocated or acquired. Obviously, you have the 440 interchange, the areas in Brentwood, like the rail cuts, and then in Franklin and some other areas where you have buildings that are immediately adjacent to the rails. We are showing also one specific area that we have. Anytime we're trying to avoid rail crossings, highway rail crossings where we can, but there are some areas like this where we have to kind of just overpass. This is near Radnor Yard, just south of 100 Oaks. We have to kind of overpass Hidco Drive, which is like I said, when we're using more like freight rail type grades, we're requiring long run-ups to get to this overpass. We do have an option for downtown. We didn't really take this to the same level that we did the rest of the alternatives, but another option would be the blue or teal line that you see is a Nashville and Eastern connection to CSX. This Nashville and Eastern is a short line that the Music City Star currently runs on. The idea would be to use their existing tracks, similar to the way that the WeGo Star currently uses the tracks, and use that to basically bypass some of the areas that we just talked about in downtown Nashville that have, significant development issues. It is a little bit longer, but it does avoid the impacts, and then it kind of gets out of the area of the stations that we had planned out for the area. Service plan, we have two different service alternatives. The commuter service would be closer to using the conventional rail equipment that I discussed earlier, whereas the rapid service would be closer to using the diesel multiple units. As you can see, the service periods are fairly typical. We'd have 15-minute peaks and 30-minute off peaks, at least in the downtown area or the Nashville built-up area out to Franklin, and then between Franklin and Columbia, those intervals would increase. Moving on, light rail. Light rail is it kind of operates the same way. It's a little bit smaller. You have smaller vehicles, more like streetcars or trams. They can operate on street. They can operate in exclusive right of way. typically can't share with freight rail, share operations with freight rail just because of the electrification and then also the differing weights. Obviously, freight rail will be much heavier than the light rail vehicles. They do provide a higher capacity than buses. They operate over more time of the day. They provide a more flexible schedule than commuter rail. The light rail transit, we have two alternatives for this, two alignments. The first one is the Interstate 65 alignment, which basically follows Interstate 65 from downtown Nashville through to the Goose Creek interchange south of Franklin or in southern Franklin. You'll notice with these two that they don't go all the way to Columbia as a commuter rail did. That's mostly a limitation of the light rail transit mode. When you have slower speeds and you have more stations, you have kind of a maximum distance before you start to really kind of lose the efficiency of the transit mode. Again, we looked at the engineering challenges. We looked at some of the things that you would have to do to get the rail in, and these are the tunnels, modified bridges, that sort of thing. We also have a hybrid alignment. This one diverges from I-65 at the Concord Road interchange in Brentwood, South Brentwood. And this would actually follow that's where the CSX line and the I-65 kind of get pretty close together. So this would diverge at there and then follow the CSX into downtown Franklin. So you have a different southern terminus instead of Goose Creek. We are going to downtown Franklin. This one kind of has the same challenges that the commuter rail does in terms of, because again, we can't, the current position of CSX is that we can't share their rail infrastructure. So this has the same challenges as commuter rail in terms of having to punch new right away through the Cool Springs area into downtown Franklin. We can show a typical section. This is a little bit more flexible than commuter rail. It has tighter radii, it has steeper grades, so we can move this as needed. Right now we're showing, generally it's adjacent to I-65 on one side or the other. It can move as needed. We can, navigate around obstacles, buildings, that sort of thing as we need to. So there's fewer impacts on that side in terms of acquisitions. We do have a station layout. This is a typical view of a station that would be located in downtown Franklin. Again, the deck that you see, the white box, I guess, is the parking deck for commuters. There's also TOD opportunities that I think Holly has probably discussed with you guys there. And again, the rail we're showing here is kind of closer to like a commuter rail in terms of the vehicle, but the vehicle that you see, the blue and white vehicle, could just as easily be trams or streetcars, provide something that's a little bit closer to that type of service. The challenges, again, this is a little bit of a different animal than the commuter rail. The challenge that we have here mostly is just trying to kind of navigate around instead of just, going through some of these obstacles. We're trying to navigate around them. What we're showing right here is in downtown Nashville, the South Inner Loop. You can see the Adventure Science Center in Fort Negley to the right of the picture. What we're proposing here is basically a tunnel that would go underneath the interstate. The reason that we have a tunnel is just to try to avoid unnecessarily long bridges, and then also to avoid some of the development that's down here. You can see the Division Street. We do have a bridge extension of that. And then just to the right of the red rectangle, the Division Street extension is Haven at the Gulch, which is a new residential development that's being proposed. So we're trying to avoid all these obstacles. More generally, through the whole corridor, the big challenge is interchange alignments. What do we do at interchanges? How do we get the light rail to a place adjacent to the interchange where it's accessible by pedestrians, and not have it in the middle of an interchange where pedestrians have to walk a long way from, say, a park and ride lot or adjacent development to get to the station. You can see some of these pictures. We have Old Hickory Boulevard, I-440, McEwen Drive, and they are all areas where we have rock cuts, where we have supports next to the roadway, that kind of thing. I do have an example on the next slide of what it would look like at Old Hickory Boulevards. The yellow dashed line that's kind of outlined in red is the is basically a long bridge. So we would have to go to an aerial guideway to kind of get around some of the, I don't know how many people are familiar with, or to what degree you're familiar with this area, but you've got CSX underneath the interstates. We'd have to go on top of the interstates and kind of navigate around all these various obstacles. We do show it here as being kind of closer to the center of the interchange. Obviously, the rock cut that's kind of in the center right of the picture. This is something that's typical throughout the entire route. Anytime we get to an interchange, we just kind of have to navigate around it, and it does drive up the cost a little bit. Service plan for each alignment, these are pretty similar to what we saw for commuter rail in terms of the service period, but we do have a little shorter inner or headways between trains for peak and off peak. So we're looking at more like 15 minutes in the downtown Nashville area, and then as we move out towards Franklin, go into 30 minutes in off peak.
Thank you, Luke. Let's pause here, give everybody a quick break before we move into bus rapid transit, and also give me an opportunity to encourage you to all go to gnrc.org/sign-in, all one word, sign-in, to let us know you participated today. It's a short survey that will capture your name and your experiences logging in through Microsoft Teams. So before you leave here today, gnrc.org, sign-in, SIGNIN, all one word. Thank you, Luke. We'll go ahead and keep going with bus rapid transit.
Yeah, so the last alternative we looked at is bus rapid transit. This is something that's similar to light rail, or it can be similar to light rail in terms of the frequency, the speed, the station distance. It is a faster alternative local bus service when you have a high demand corridor. It's pretty flexible. I think that's probably the main thing to drive with this alternative is that, we can use exclusive lanes, we can use semi-exclusive lanes. As Michael said, bus on shoulder is an option with this. But once we get up to certain higher frequencies and we get to exclusive lanes, it is operating as basically the slide says, the bus version of LRT. Again, we have two alignments that we looked at for these. The first one is just almost exactly like the LRT alignment. This one would go down the median of Interstate 65, so we would have to widen Interstate 65 in most places, to allow for the installation of exclusive bus lanes in the middle. That being said, it is a little less impactful. We also have the arterial alignments. This would actually diverge from I-65 north of I-440 and then south of Cool Springs Boulevard, or at Cool Springs Boulevard, and would run along arterial streets in Nashville and Franklin to make its way to Wego Central and then to downtown Franklin. We would run along arterial streets, would be a mixture of exclusive lanes in the median. It may run in mixed traffic. We have the typical sections. Like I said, it may run in the middle of I-65 in exclusive lanes. We do have a buffer between that and the general purpose lanes and the HOV lanes. We have a bus on shoulder typical section as well that would basically not require very much widening on I-65. And then you can see for Cool Springs Boulevard, Mac Hatcher, roadways like that where we have either an extra lane that is bus only, or we have a separate guideway in the median for buses. Some challenges for this, the station layout. This is at Cool Springs Boulevard, and as I said, this is showing what it would look like if it was in the median of I-65. You can see a little bit higher detail. These are the park and ride structured parking that we have on each side of the roadway. Obviously, it would provide connections to adjacent development, which includes some of the developments on the Carruthers Parkway, as well as the Gallery at Cool Springs. Some of the challenges that we have for this is mostly limited to what we can do at areas where we just don't have a single interstate typical section. This is the South Loop. You can see Fort Negley again and the Adventure Science Center. What we would need here is basically a flyover bridge to connect the bus lanes into the inner loop. we don't have as much, unlike light rail, we don't really have as much in terms of, bus exclusive, flyovers, aerial guideways, that sort of thing. We do have exclusive use ramps. This would apply to the arterial option, where obviously there's not a interchange at Berry Road right now. It's too close to 440. So what we would do is put in exclusive use ramps for the buses to get off and make its way over to 8th Avenue, which is the roadway at the bottom of the picture. Some of the challenges that we have generally with widening, whether it's bus on shoulder or it's buses in the median, is what to do in areas where we have deficient shoulders, or not deficient shoulders, but not enough shoulder or other obstacles at the side of the road. This is showing Sidco Drive, Harding Place, and Moore's Lane. What we would have to do in these situations is either navigate around these obstacles or otherwise widen the roadway and then rebuild these ramps, redo the drainage, move the barriers. In the case of Moore's Lane, the bridges would have to be replaced. But the impacts overall probably not as much as the commuter rail or the light rail. Service plan is almost exactly identical to the light rail, going back to what I said, where it can provide similar levels of service. Obviously, we have the same situation where you have in the downtown area, they would run at 15-minute headways. Those headways would increase to 30 minutes in the off-peak once it moved out of downtown Nashville into the area through Brentwoods and into Franklin. I should have mentioned also when I was talking about where we're stopping short of Columbia, we do have for both the LRT and the BRT, we're proposing express bus service from Spring Hill and from Columbia to the southernmost terminals for both of these options. So we're still providing service to areas down into Columbia. Again, it's just an issue of the limitations of BRT and light rail as to how far you can take it before you start to have breakdowns in service. So cost estimates, this nice friendly red slide. We looked at peer projects, comparable projects around the country for each one of these modes to see what their costs are versus how many stations they have, what the mile is. Probably the number to look at is the cost per mile, which is the far right column. The teal at the bottom is the estimate that we have for the South Corridor currently. As you can see, a commuter rail is a pretty wide variety, from all the way from 17 million per mile up to 721 million per mile. We're sliding in at about, I guess it would be the lower range when you're talking about 721 million per mile. We also have for light rail, the two alignments again at the bottom. This gets a little bit more consistent between various projects. I would say we're slotting in about the middle, maybe a little bit on the low side. And again, this is really highly dependent on what these areas are going through. We try to pick projects that were moving through similarly developed areas that had the similar challenges. And for bus rapid transit, kind of the same thing. We have, it's a little bit closer in terms of the cost per mile. We do have for the next slide, the kind of a breakdown of the initial implementation costs for commuter rail. You see the bus rapid transit is cheaper than the light rail and the commuter rail both. We do have, it does vary depending on what's, especially for BRT, it does vary depending on what's included. Again, if we did bus on shoulder, if we do the arterial option versus the Interstate 65 option, there's a wide range of costs. Operations and maintenance. On the next slide, we have operations and maintenance costs. These are the annual costs to operate these. Again, a little bit of a wider range, but you do have different options between BRT and commuter rail as to how much. And that's all I have if anybody has any questions.
Appreciate that, Luke. Any questions now? In thinking about sort of where we are in the schedule and just the limitations of conversation over this platform, I think we might do a quick follow-up survey after today's call to get your initial impressions of what was presented. I also want to poll you on an opportunity to reconvene really soon, just for the purposes of conversations. And we report those results back to you from the survey and just talk about them so you're not overcome with PowerPoints. But again, I think that's an idea we might pursue after today. Any though immediate reaction or comments or questions? All right, well, we'll move forward. Again, if you have any questions or comments, just put them in the chat. Again, we'll follow up with you today with the survey and schedule some time for just the conversation itself. We're going to move on into the home stretch here as we wrap up today's meeting and just give a preview of going back to the question that KB asked earlier about what we mean by test. And I mentioned there were 3 parts to this. I'm going to ask Glenn Coyne to take the first 2, then I'll talk about the third.
Thanks, Michael. And again, we are getting near the end, so thank you for your patience and your attention. As we decide how to evaluate each of these alternatives that Luke just walked through, there's really going to be the technical engineering side of this. So we'll just compare the kind of metrics that Luke talked about. You know, how many bridges do we have to build? How many engineering challenges do we have to overcome, and then compare each one as to what the costs are for both capital and operating, and then what the service levels look like, and then how the stations are located and what type of development might happen around those stations. So we'll look at those are just a lot of numbers and comparing each of those 5 alternatives to each other and to figure out then how we can make some recommendations just on that technical side. And again, that's real important, not only so we can see what the costs and the design features are, but also if we go for funding. Michael talked about other corridors that we're able to get some funding. We're going to have that engineering, that technical background in place so that we can go and seek out those funding opportunities at the federal level. The second piece of this is something that we call triple bottom line, and we've teamed up with Wilmot, and we've had some fantastic interactions with them, and we've been really feeding off each other with only this with the technical stuff, but also would these projects impact people's lives? What would the impact be on the social, economic, and the environment? And we're not looking at them as coming out with just numbers and just facts, but we're saying, what are the impacts? What actually would be the benefit of these type of things? And so there you're looking at how much time would people have in their day if they were saving time not driving, or what would some of the economic impact be of having this type of an investment in their communities? And then the social equity piece, there's people who don't have cars or who elect not to have a car, or we have a lot going on with reverse commuting. So if people live in Nashville and come out to a job at one of the major shopping centers or something like that, those are the type of things that we look both ways to see what some of the equity pieces are. But there's a whole lot of social and environmental and economic impacts that come out of this that we just can't tell if we give you a raw number. It's something that is an impact that is more based on what the impact will be to society. So we feel like for this corridor, it's very important to look at both the technical and the triple bottom line impacts based on all of those factors. So we have a pretty complicated matrix where we are filling it in with all the information that we can find on these different metrics and these different measures. And out of that, we'll be able to rank these 5 different alternatives and be able to tell a story about what the impacts of each of those are. And Michael, if you want to touch on the third one.
Yeah, thank you for that, Glenn. Just to add on to sort of the bottom line of the triple bottom line, it's basically to make sure we're not basing our ROI or cost benefit analysis on solely sort of the ridership for dollars spent. There's a broader benefit to investing in transit that has demonstrated to yield significant returns to the economy as a result of that investment. And so it's important that we consider those as we're looking at these big price tags, which are going to be sticker shock, but they should be surprising because they're truly on par with what other regions have spent within America. In terms of the political feasibility, this is as important as the other 2 here, and I apologize for the list of examples, just ignore that. But what we're really talking about is making sure that as we finalize the recommendation, that we also do a true assessment of the political feasibility for each of these options. To what extent can we generate project champions, particularly political champions, to see it through? These are long roads to travel to get this stuff implemented. What kind of core group of supporters are we going to have to endure that challenge? And then specifically need to assess, what the obstacles or hurdles would be from a policy or legislative standpoint. I think, the mayors have done a really good job over the last couple of years, particularly working with Mark Cate and his group at Stones River Group, to build some vision towards the future, sort of acknowledge now that there are going to need to be changes within local and state policy to enable implementation. And so we'll take a look at that as it relates specifically to this corridor and the recommendations that come out of the study. I'll turn it back over to you, Glenn, to talk about how the results of this analysis may look to the public as we roll out the results.
Thanks. And like I said before, we could just submit to GNRC and to WeGo and our partners a very thick binder full of facts and figures and say, here's your report and good luck. But we feel like it's more important to be able, as I said, to tell the story. And we definitely want to lean towards a more graphic heavy way to do that. And I talked about that in the existing conditions and trends report, with being very careful about how we display information on maps and on charts. And I think that as we go back to the public this last time, with some recommendations and with a lot of facts and figures, and Luke just took you through the complexities of what these alternatives look like and the different challenges and the numbers and costs and time, service plans. There's a lot to digest, and so we're hoping to be able to use graphics on the par of what you see on the screen now to be able to break it out for folks so that they can see how it impacts them. So when we talk about comparing what other communities may have done or what the cost per mile might be, what does that really mean? And compare it then to what those benefits are, not just fiscally and not just to the engineering side, but to those triple bottom line impacts as well. So we're working with both GNRC, with WeGo, and with Wilmon, and coming up with what those graphics are going to look like. And we're really excited to get to that point.
Thank you, Glenn. So I've put on the screen here sort of the elephant in the room, something we haven't really talked about yet. And the next couple of slides, which are aimed at some conversation, because we need to get your perspectives on kind of how this is going to impact us. What we have in terms of slides really is talking about COVID-19 with respects to community engagement and how to go about that. But we had a really good conversation this week with our Transportation Policy Board that the impact of the pandemic, the public health crisis, which is now turning into an economic crisis, transcends like methods for community engagement. It's really, we really probably need to assess how this has shifted people's attitudes and opinions about mobility in general. I hope that the concerns about public transit as a as a way to get close to people and transmitting viruses. I hope that's a short-term view of public transit, but it's on people's minds now. And I think more broadly than just the transmission of a disease on a form of transportation as being a concern, there's always also just the curiosity on how this sort of wide-scale telework is going to shift people's minds and attitudes about transportation investments into the future. I think public transit is very complementary to a broader scale of telework. But I guess my point is, and what we talked about at the policy board meeting the other day, is we don't really know what people are thinking about right now. And they may not even know what they think right now in terms of the long-term implications of COVID-19 on their attitudes towards transportation. So that's something we need to assess. We need to assess not only how to engage folks while we are prohibited from having 10 or more people in a room together, at least through June, maybe beyond, and how to assess the limitations of just trying to do this online only. This is an important decision that is being made with respect to a recommendation. I should limit that to it's a decision about a recommendation. It's important. So we need to get your ideas and thoughts about where you are in your thinking about the impacts of COVID-19, either from a community engagement perspective or just sort of the reassessment of our own sense of priorities and weight when it comes to the toolbox of transportation options that we've been studying and considering for the last few years. So I'll pause here with this slide on the screen and open it up, recognizing that sometimes it's difficult to have a full conversation online, but I'd love for one or two or three of you to give us your thoughts about how COVID-19 changes our pathway forward. I may just call on a couple of people to get this started. And I know Steve Bland is always so good at communicating his thought process. He's probably been thinking a lot about that first thing I mentioned. Steve, you want to talk about sort of the short-term sort of response to transit?
Michael?
Oh, yes. Go ahead, KB.
I have a question. I know the alternatives that you presented, was there any specific constraints that limited our ability to have an alternative that looked at an express service from Nashville all the way to Columbia? Because I don't think I saw that as an option in there.
There was an option. There was. Will you repeat your question? Just make sure I'm answering the right one. What was the first part of that?
Sorry, I said that I don't think I saw an alternative that looked at an express service from Nashville downtown to Columbia, the full length of the South Corridor.
Okay, so when you say express service, do you mean within the context of these build options, or you mean like express bus service? I mean,
in the context of the alternative evaluation that we put out.
Yeah, so I think we did, like, the commuter rail option does go down to Columbia. And then I think what WSP said in terms of the light rail was just that most light rail lines in America have a limited sort of maximum distance before you lose the efficiencies of that specific technology. But if it's the will of the group to kind of consider the what if we were to build sort of that new trackage with that technology to Columbia, it's certainly possible to look at that. And I have no preference myself. I just want to make sure we're testing things that are sort of practical. But I also went to high school in Columbia, have a lot of respect for the mayor of Columbia and the people that live there, and I know they want to be in the analysis here. So it certainly is on the commuter rail side. Now, for the other options where the map doesn't show the line going to Columbia, what you're not seeing on those maps is that there are complementary, adjacent, and connecting services to the end of line. So it's not like it's left out altogether. It's just, I think the engineering team felt like they wanted to constrain the project design itself within sort of generally accepted standards for the modes that we're looking at. Is that, you follow me?
Yeah, I do. Okay. Now, in terms of the ridership component, is that the next step for us to evaluate to see if the ridership analysis will support these alternatives in terms of capacity, or that has also been covered already?
Yeah, that's part of the triple bottom line analysis that we talked about. A brief update on where we are with that. So the ridership models are good to go. What we're doing now is working with each of the local communities along the way to put into place the land use assumptions. So we've run ridership forecast for just the trend land use, but we know that any major investment in transit, it's going to change the land use. And so we're working with the local planners to figure out what that would look like so that we can have an appropriate forecast of ridership that was matched up with what you would expect from a land use perspective. But you're absolutely spot on, KB. The ridership is a big part of our evaluation, as well as travel time savings and so on and so forth. But that's part of the triple bottom line analysis that we mentioned.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, thinking back on COVID-19, Steve, would you share your perspective, at least on sort of the short-term implications from a customer standpoint or your operations as it relates to COVID-19? I didn't tell Steve I was going to ask him to do that, so he may be muted or
Okay.
multitasking. So
I think I've unmuted now. So
you're good. I can hear you.
To be frank, short term, well, there's really two areas we're having, challenges with. One of them is the same challenge you're having in terms of public engagement. It's really difficult to do effective public engagement, in this manner. And we're even seeing it, we're groups of people who are used to being together, and there's not usually a shortage of opinions, and we're just challenged by the format. It's a great way to present information, not necessarily a great way to discuss and have that dialogue. That's number one. Number two, and we're really seeing this around the world, and we are absolutely seeing it in Nashville, is when you look at the decline in ridership on transit systems, and it's certainly the issue here in Nashville, we've seen a much greater, and when I say much greater, rate of decline, probably 5 times the level of decline on what I would call our commuter express services as we have on like our local urban routes, where you tend to have, shorter trips, frankly, more transit dependent populations, more life necessity trips, frankly, less of an opportunity for those folks to work from home and work remotely. We've seen some of our services on the RTA side are down over 90% ridership, and some of our routes on the MTA side are down less than 20% in ridership. And that all probably comes back, at the same time we all decide we're going to, go back to Predators games and go back to movie theaters and crowded restaurants. So I don't think it's permanent, but I do think it's not, where we expect some ridership to return, really beginning as Nashville goes through its phases of reopening. I think a lot of the Star is a great example. I think getting back to our prior levels of ridership on the Star, we're probably a couple of years from that.
Wow, interesting. Thank you for sharing that. Anybody else have any immediate reaction to these questions or want to share your thoughts about how we move forward?
This is Chuck Downham with the City of Spring Hill. I mean, one of the things that we continue to have conversations with our community about, we're predominantly a bedroom community serving the employment centers starting in Franklin, Brentwood, and on into downtown. And a large mass of our population has remained home as a result of COVID. And so as those folks start to think about and contemplate, and their companies start to contemplate returning to work, I think what we're seeing now is a very thoughtful transition and some thoughtful planning going on in terms of just the office environments in general. And I think we're going to see some changes in the commuting patterns where a lot of folks that pretty much were forced as a result of COVID to work from home, work remotely, are now being given the choice and the preference to work at home. Not only to relieve workspace from crowded conditions where transmittal is much easier, but to hopefully minimize, the potential transmittal of that by working remotely. So I honestly don't see us returning to an old normal. I think it's going to become a new normal that's going to be defined by a completely different office environment and work environment, that's driven largely by, people wanting to minimize exposure for their employees. And that's something that we continue to hear pretty loud and clear from residents here, is that a lot of them have every intention of continuing to work from home because the employers have given them the opportunity to do so, and that they're being able to work very effectively in that kind of environment. So just a thought there that I think this is a much longer term transition that we're going to see in terms of just commuting patterns in general. That's it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Chuck. Others agree, disagree with that? Okay. Well, like I said, I think you just thinking out loud at this point, we didn't talk about this as a team, but I think it might be appropriate if y'all are agreeable, and I'll get a sense of that from the poll that we do after today, that we just have a call that's set up for the purposes of conversation. We can send out some sort of discussion questions, much like what we have on the screen today, and so people can put some thought into it, and we'll come up with a good system to facilitate, a natural conversation as much as we can in the coming days. But Before we move on, any other questions or comments as we just got a couple more slides for you before we send you on your way. It's about 2:14 now. Any other comments or questions? All right, seeing none. I'll just turn it back over to Glenn Coyne to wrap us up with a look at next steps, both for us and for you as committee members.
Thanks, Michael. Again, what we're going to be focused on is making sure that not only do we finish our efforts here and come out with something that is definitely usable, but to do it in a way that is something that the community can embrace, that they can understand, and that we present it in a way that that there's more community conversation around what we do with transit in this corridor, and doesn't just stop with the report. So we see this very much as, finalizing the deliverables that we need to come up with and have you as committee members review and give us input and feedback on. We'd definitely like to hear your input on the alternatives that Luke walked through today. That's a lot of information in a very short amount of time, but we hope that you can get into those and ask us questions about those. One of the things that's really going to be important with this is to, whether it's GNRC or WeGo or our consulting group or all of us together, is to meet with the folks at TDOT and talk to their leadership, talk to their engineers, talk to the planning folks, so that they take a look at what we're talking about. And there's so many things that are happening with transportation in the region that we really need to coordinate with that. And so Michael's going to lead us on that, but we're going to definitely find ways to have frequent and really in-depth meetings on this project and how it relates to others. One of the things that is most exciting for me is this land use and TOD, transit-oriented development opportunity. And we've had 2 calls already, and we have a couple next week with the communities, and really talking about what it means in terms of the potential for transit-oriented development to not just be a transportation improvement, but an economic development incentive as well. So we've had 2 great calls. I've learned a lot about the communities that we've talked to so far, and looking forward to the other 2. The biggest task in front of us is to complete the evaluation of the alternatives, that matrix that I was telling you about with both the technical engineering side and the triple bottom line side, and making sure that we really look at each of these alternatives and compare them to each other and be able to tell the story of how they each compare. And then, as we just talked about, a very good conversation, what does community engagement look like going forward? Not only for this project, but as this project gets discussed over the next months and years and gets closer to implementation, is going to be very important. So those are the things that we're going to be focused on over the next month, 2 months, to try to get this project to a place where we can get it to you for review and comment. And which leads to...
Well, hey, Glenn.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think there's been a few questions posed in the chat box. I'm to give you guys now on the WSP time so you could be thinking about answers while I cover the next slide. But let me get those questions out on the table. First question is from Steve regarding construction cost estimates for rail in particular, and the assumptions that may have been made in terms of the cost estimation for right-of-way in the event that obviously we can't use the CSX tracks themselves. So what do both the construction and operating costs assume in terms of shared track usage fees, and how have we incorporated right-of-way into that? So that's one set of questions for you to come back to us with before we end the call here in a minute. Question about, again, from Steve about the looking at better utilization of HOV lanes, enforcing and converting HOV lanes to more broadly applicable managed lanes. So how are we thinking about that? I have responded to that question saying that we also have Neil Schaefer about to get started to look at, sort of a optimization of the existing highway facility and what a highway expansion project would cost as a comparison to these transit options. So that is also underway, where we're thinking about managed lanes. But that's another question for you guys to end with here in a bit, is how you're considering managed lanes. And then Rochelle Carpenter with TDOT has asked, at what point will we begin really thinking about the walking and biking connections? as part of the study. And we'll get into the sort of the nuts and bolts on that. So 3 good questions from the chat. I'm going to cover the next steps for the committee, and then I'll come back to you a final time so you can provide your initial responses to those questions, which then we will follow up by email with more thorough responses. Sound good?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
All right, you guys. So in terms of the committee actions, the next steps here, you have available, well, Glenn mentioned earlier that they're wrapping up the final draft versions of the existing conditions and trends reports and the findings from the community engagement to date. You have early versions of that posted to the shared drive. You can look at those, but we have some much improved deliverables coming your way soon. They'll be posted and I'll share those with you. As soon as they're posted, we would really like to get your final review and comment on those 2 deliverables specifically. You already have available, though, the second bullet, the narrative reports for the build alternatives that were presented to you today. So if you could start reviewing those now and provide us comments that you might have, so we can either tweak those alternatives before testing or be thinking about how we'll take your comments and use them to optimize the alternatives on the back end. And then finally, be thinking about ideas, tools, and resources for community engagement. So as we pull together this next webinar for the purposes of conversation, be thinking about that topic so we could really hit that pretty hard. I mean, until we figure that out, it's sort of limiting in terms of thinking about community engagement. So that's a look at what we're asking you to do next. The second 2 bullets, you could begin working on that now. Hopefully we'll have those final draft deliverables to you in that first bullet ready soon. But just as a reminder, there is a shared drive that's got meeting materials for all of our meetings to date, all the deliverables that we have received, the core deliverables. There's a lot of sort of smaller type memos that we haven't posted that are more sausage making, but all the deliverables that are sort of sketched out in the scope of work that we've received are available to you on that shared drive. And if you haven't browse that yet, please do so. All the fact sheets and sort of talking points that we produced early on for public engagement, that's all there as well. So Glenn, I'm going to come back to you to answer those questions, and then we'll open it up and for any final comments and then send everybody on their way.
Thanks, Michael. I think Brad Winkler is going to take the first one.
Yes, Steve, your question about the right-of-way costs, particularly in areas where there's substantial potential impacts in CSX, there are pretty prescriptive separation requirements. We've got a fairly hefty contingency placed on the cost estimates at this point, but I think our belief and our thought is in the estimating portion is that there's some areas that we will need CSX to willingly negotiate access to their tracks, particularly say in the Kane rail yard area where they operate 6 to 7 tracks in that area, and it's not reasonable to assume that we're going to want to tear down the new Assyrian building or the Pine Street Flats in order to meet their separation requirements. So in those areas, I think the assumption is that it'll have to be some successful negotiations with them to gain access in those areas. In the areas where it's primarily their main track, which is from that rail yard down through the Radnor yard to Brentwood, our assumption is we'll have to operate in our own right of way because of that being a main track. But once you hit the split in just south of Brentwood, the alignment follows a much lighter used rail track. And although we've currently estimated running parallel to it, again, that might be another opportunity where we could get an agreement to utilize that piece of track, the one that ties into the short line that enters into Columbia.
Brad, this is Steve, and I know we're trying to wrap up the meeting, and I can have a sideline conversation with other folks, but I guess the couple concerns is with both the quantity and the quality of the right-of-way that would need to be acquired. I guess I'd be concerned if we're benchmarking on the low end of typical commuter rail. And the other challenge will be if there's even a little bit of integration. I mean, frankly, I have a hard time envisioning CSX going along with it unless, frankly, what we pay them is comparable to, you know, the hundreds of millions that right-of-way would cost. There's the issue if there is any interaction of the two systems that we'd have to be completely integrated into positive train control with them, which would be an extraordinarily expensive piece of the project. But we
Absolutely.
can get into a little bit more in the weeds on that as you develop your alternatives.
Absolutely.
All right, thank you for that, Steve. Glenn, next question.
The second one, Michael, I think you kind of answered that one, but I don't know if Brad or Luke wants to talk about that one too, from an engineering side. Whether we looked at smaller or shorter term improvements.
Yeah, so some of what Steve is getting at is just sort of better utilization of the HOV and managed lanes, which is something that our team at GNRC can model that isn't specific to the transit options on the South Corridor. So those are conversations we're already having in terms of not just the South Corridor and I-65, but other corridors across the mid-state in terms of either better utilization of our current HOV or their conversion to another type of managed lane. So we'll run scenarios, Steve, that show some what ifs, you know, what kind of benefits we would get if we had that. And then we could also build in those assumptions into the ridership models. There'll be a handful of ridership model scenarios. So we'll produce ridership with a different set of assumptions across a couple of scenarios. You know, one specific scenario that I know we need to account for now is an increased rate of telework. You know, we got to figure that out, but that will need to be a scenario that we run for the ridership models, as well as, you know, an evolution of our HOV system. And then the final question in terms of walk bike, you know, I'd say, you know, very clearly that's an extension of the conversations we're having around transit oriented development. I mean, right now, those conversations are largely based around like trying to get an understanding of the mixture of uses and the level of density. But as we begin to sharpen the recommendation for where TODs would be going, then thinking through the design of that built environment and what kind of walk bike connections you would need to have from area neighborhoods and retail and office destinations to make sure that prospective passengers or customers of transit can get to and from those stations. But WSP, any additional thought about bike ped?
Yeah, Michael, I think that's a great point, and I was going to answer very similarly, but I think the TOD, transit-oriented development discussion is one, but the very locations that we're recommending for the stations took into account a radius of usually a quarter mile or even up to a half mile for where people are comfortable walking to those stations. And we also looked at what type of connections are available to some of the planned and existing recreational paths or commuting paths and bike lanes and things like that. So it's definitely a big piece of what we're looking at. And as Michael said, it will feed into the model as to how pedestrians and how people on bikes get to the station and get access to the transit improvements. So and that's another thing that we're hoping to see as a outcome of this is that if we do build the improvement and have a station, we would hope that people would have an attraction to that, to walk to it and to bike to it, where they might not be thinking about that location right now. So very good question.
All right, if there are any additional questions after today's call, just shoot them our way. We will get you answers. We'll be sending out a recap. Let me make sure I'm okay. Sorry, I lost the screen. I just want to make sure I wasn't muted. But we'll send out a recap. We'll poll the group for your appetite for a meeting just focused on conversation and to get your initial impressions to the presentation of alternatives today. Before you turn your attention to another topic, please remember to go to gnrc.org/sign in, all one word, to let us know that you are here today. Otherwise, I really appreciate your time. We're 15 minutes or so over, so thank you for that. Thank you to the elected officials who joined us today. I know Senator Yarborough also was on the line for a good period of time if he's not still there. So once again, thanks everyone. I want to thank all of our staff at GNRC and WeGo Public Transit for all the preparation for today's meeting, as well as the great work that the WSP team has been doing over the last couple of months. So thanks again, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you.